tutorial. In this video, I show you how to paint portrait in only 5 steps. The lesson tutorials here step by step from beginning to end and how to paint this portrait, and you will be able to paint like I did. Just follow the link in the description to watch the full lessons. Okay, let's start the paint process. I began was filling out the face was light skin tone. The goal is build up the color values that become observed on the reference photo. Many beginners artists make the mistakes that either paint too dark in the beginning or the pinch too light, and they never reach the color values that are on the reference photo. So we are going to keep an eye on the color values all the time and slowly building up them by starting with the light skin tone in the face area. And we are building a base for later layers of watercolors and color pencils. While the paint is still wet in the portrait portion, we can add little bit of red to the cheeks and a little bit of darker orange to the neck area, so that the color can be bleed out and create some smooth blending. I often use this effect to fill the area. It is important to choose colors that fit to the reference photo. It does help to make color studies. I am working with a watercolor palette from local stationeries, and I must say I will love this color palette. It is incredibly easy to work with. I even like it more than the high-priced brushstroke watercolor that I usually use, because the watercolors can be lifted off very easily from the paper. When you paint with watercolors and the watercolors is dried, you can use a wet brush and go over the dried area, or also of a wet area and brush will be lifted up. Some of the watercolors, again, this is a very hit trick if you either want to correct the mistake. So maybe you have a paint area too dark and you want to make it a little bit lighter, or you want to smooth out edges with marks. However, was Camel Artist watercolors, I have no problem whatsoever. I can lift up the watercolors and I can also build layers. So this is my first watercolor palette that I will recommend it for beginners. It's really wonderful to work with that. If you have any good watercolors you want recommended, just put them in a comment section. I bet there are many people who love to see what you are recommending us. Anyway, back to the portrait lesson. So the next step is the let everything dry. You can use a hair dryer to speed up your process. However, when your paint is super wet and to use hair dryer, maybe you can see how much the abstract effects have changed after they tried. This is very normal, and the brand of the paper and also the watercolors that you used have huge effects on how dried watercolors will look like here. For this portrait, I did not use my Visual Fabriano hot pressed watercolor paper, which I use for almost all my watercolor paintings. I used a cheap watercolor papers, and the abstract effects did not dry as I expected them to dry normally. They make prettier edges and you have even more abstractions of them with the Fabriano paper, but on cheap papers are just generally on different sorts of paper, you get completely different behavior of the watercolor. Since try out different kinds of papers to see what fits best of your style and what you want to your watercolor paper. The way that I paint make me use some brands of paper, but you might want something entirely different, so definitely try out different kinds of paper and see what works best for you. After everything has dried, I continue painting on the portrait portion again, and here I am continuing the process of building up the desired color values. For example, I start mixing darker skin tone for areas around the eyes and the eyebrows, and I also fill in the lips, iris and eyelashes. It is super important to paint the eyes, even especially the iris, and for that I am using Artman brushes and Artman detail brushes. Currently there are in my favorite brands of watercolor brushes. They give me the most control and they also hold a lot of water. You can paint with the cheap brushes or painted with the cheap brushes for the longest time, but if you want to have a really good control over details, I definitely suggest you to get a good detail brush for something like iris and eyelashes. It's pretty hard to control watercolor so that you doesn't get ugly lines. So good brushes is very helpful, or if you don't have a good brush, just try to hold your hands very still and try to get a clean lines. It's definitely difficult and it takes a little bit of practice. If you don't get the lines right, you can correct it later, so you don't get a lot of strong shadows, which make the painting process a little bit easier because you don't have to get so deep and dark with the shadows, but it also does not make it look very deep and three-dimensional. So if you are looking to create a portrait that has a lot of depth and maybe looks very realistic, I would suggest using a photo that has a lot of shadows where the light comes from above. For the example, and you have the shadows directly beneath the nose, the eyes and the lips, but basically you can paint each photo that you find on the internet. For that you take yourself, but keep in mind the light is an important factor for the painting in there. In the next step I am continue with a detailing process. After having finished the face, I continue working on the hair. And here again I want to have it very abstract and to look painterly. You don't have to do that. You can paint the hair realistically so that I don't have to correct them. I want the hair to look very loose, and I want to make each brush strokes count. If you think about each brush stroke that you do, it can have a lot of impact on your painting. Sometimes it looks more aesthetically if you only used a couple of brush strokes and to render something instead of the thousands of different brush strokes. This is of course depends on this style. It isn't true for everything. Here for the hair, I think it was the right choice to just paint the hair and a couple of brush strokes. I started with adding some dark portion of the hair, and there for the tips I used a lighter shades of brown, and I masked it while it was still wet into the darker on the hair, so that we have this beautiful watery effect and the blending between the two colors. And for the details I used to detail brush for the artment to add a couple of fly hairs and tiny hair stands to make everything for dynamic and lively. And for the last step we are going to have some fun for me. This is really the best part of the painting. It feels amazing. I can get rid of all of my loose that I might have accumulated over the day, and I feel like real painter. So I covered the face, was posted and mixed the couple of different colors, and then I splattered him quietly over the portrait. This was so much fun, and this is the final step of the painting. And for the white splashes I just use white acrylic. White watercolors is not very opaque, so I just did not even bother with it and just mixed white acrylics. And then in the end I added some finishing touches on the face, because in the end you will notice here and there maybe some color values that you want to change, make, or maybe some details. And last step of the portrait for me is always correcting some little details. If you did, don't forget to leave a comment, give a video thumbs up, and subscribe my channel. See you in the next one. Bye.